We'll go on to our next presentation now, and I want to bring on Frédéric Dejean, who's a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the Université de Québec et Montréal, and he'll be presenting a paper, as I understand, on the Haitian evangelical churches in Montreal with respect to resilience and asylum seekers. Take it away. You're on mute, Frédéric.
Now you hear me, I think. Okay, sorry. Excuse me. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. The title of my presentation is Coping with the Experience of Displacement, the Role of Christian Churches with Haitian Asylum Seekers in Montreal. And we will see that the notion of coping and religious coping is very important for the chapter we will submit very soon. So just to introduce, wait, it's not, okay. So in 2017, the Quebec discovered the realities of many asylum seekers who crossed the border between the US and the Canada at La Colle, not far from Montreal. During the summer of 2017, the city of Montreal turned the Olympic Stadium into a welcome center for asylum seekers. And such a picture you can see on the PowerPoint, because it was like an iconic picture, a symbol, traveled all around the world. The same year, more than 7,300 Haitian people crossed the border, and they constituted more than 30% of the world asylum seekers entering Canada. Nevertheless, 1 year after, in 2018, Haitian citizens represented the minority of asylum seekers entering Canada. My presentation is about the story of these people who arrived in Canada, most of them having been through very hard times. It is about welcome and hospitality. More precisely, it is about the role of Christian churches, most of them evangelical, in the process of integration and inclusion in the Quebecer society. The research is based on interviews with 10 pastors or 10 religious leaders, because they were not only pastors, 9 evangelical pastors in evangelical churches, and 1 Catholic. Because maybe you know, but in Montreal, there is an Haitian Catholic mission, Notre Dame d'Haïti. And we conducted as well 20 interviews with asylum seekers. And most of these interviews were conducted in Creole. So because I cannot speak Creole, I worked with a sociologist who was a postdoc fellow with me a few years ago, Emerson Jean-Baptiste. So for my presentation, I don't want to spend too much time on the context of intervention of the churches. So I just want to give you few elements about the context in Montreal. Probably you know that Montreal is the 3rd biggest Haitian diaspora in the world, right after Miami and New York. The presence of Haitian in Quebec goes back to the 1960s. There was a second wave in the 70s and a third wave in the 90s. In 2011, more than 120,000 people had an Haitian origin. And it is important to precise that most of these people lived in the Montreal area, either in the city of Montreal or in the suburbs of Montreal. In the majority, Haitian people are Catholic, but 40% of them are evangelicals. In Montreal, in my own research on evangelicals, I estimate that there are about 150 Haitian evangelical churches. Just to give you an idea, in the borough of Montreal Nord, which is in the north of Montreal, there are about between 40 and 45 Haitian churches. So it's very important in Montreal. Just few words about the trajectories of asylum seekers in Quebec. For the research, we found out three main categories of asylum seekers: those who had chosen Canada and directly arrived from Haiti, those who lived in the US after the earthquake of 2010 and then had to leave the US, and finally, a third category, those who spend years in South America, especially in Brazil, and travel to Canada in very precarious conditions. Now, the field of intervention of the churches in 2017. We conducted 10 interviews with religious leaders, and all the religious leaders told that their churches had been involved with asylum seekers. And some of them precise that they directly went to the Olympic Stadium to get into contact with the asylum seekers. So the churches were really key actors in 2017 with the asylum seekers crisis in Quebec. We can sum up the intervention and the importance of churches with the formula of the 3R: refugee, respectability, and resources. Refugee is linked to the feeling of loss of social ties, and loss of cultural landmarks. Asylum seekers have to deal with this situation. And regarding to this feeling, evangelical churches are like safe spaces for where asylum seekers found cultural landmarks, even if they were not much involved in churches in their country of origin. The second R, respectability, is linked to the recognition asylum seekers are looking for. This recognition is the feeling that their life has a value. In churches, they are considered as brothers and sisters in Christ, and in the eyes of God, each human life has the same importance and the same value. And this value and this importance has a sharp contrast with their everyday life experience because of their administrative status, where they have the feeling that they are less important than other people. And finally, the last R, resources, refers to the materials and immaterials that asylum seekers were provided with by churches. I directly go to the third section. If you want to learn more, you will have to read the chapter. The third section, the churches as protection factors. As you probably know, the word resilience is today a buzzword. First used in psychology, it is now widely used by the social sciences. Psychologists define resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity. In a book titled Psychologie de la résilience, the French psychologist Marie Anneau adds something very important for our discussion. She defines résilience as l'art de s'adapter aux situations adverses en montrant des capacités qui mettent en jeu des ressources internes et externes. So, what is important in this quotation is that resilience is not only about a person. Resilience is a process involving a person and an environment. Resilience works when there are factors of protection which are both linked to the person and linked to the environment. For instance, the family, community organizations, or religious institutions. And there is a second notion which is important for our discussion. This is a notion of coping. Uh, Coping is close to resilience, but it's not exactly the same thing. Some authors in psychology speak about religious coping, and religious coping is framed uh, is a religiously framed cognitive, emotional, or behavioral responses to stress, encompassing multiple methods and purposes, as well as positive and negative dimensions.
2-minute warning.
Yep. So just to finish with the idea of we in the chapter we try to address the issue of churches as spaces of resilience. Regarding the notion of resilience or religious coping, it is important to consider two levels. The first level is a sociological level. In the wake of sociology of networks, one can consider churches as organizations whose one of the most important aspects is the production of social ties. And for instance, the German sociologist Georg Simmel wrote, the faith which has come to be regarded as the essential, the substance of religion, is first a relation between individuals. Uh, Other authors contend that social ties in religious organizations draws on trust and trustworthiness. For instance, Robert Putnam uh, contends that trustworthiness lubricates social life. It was clear from the interviews that many asylum seekers develop social ties based on trust in the churches. And there are social ties with the church members who sometimes share the same experience of displacement and immigration. And there are social ties with pastors. Um just uh, uh, just to conclude, a few words about the second aspect we try to address in the chapter. This is the question of how asylum seekers use religion as a frame to tell and give a meaning to their experience. Religion provides them with the necessary words to tell a story which often is full of traumas. In a research with Muslims Kosovars, Godiak explained that the Kosovars conceptualized their suffering as a spiritual experience and turned to Islam to recover from war trauma. We could say exactly the same thing with the Haitian asylum seekers. Thank you. I will just
Thank
finish.
you, Frederic. That's great. So our last speaker, let me introduce, is Mireille Paquette, and she's an associate professor of political science and the research chair on the new politics of immigration